Welcome back. You're watching KTN News Desk. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights now says in a report it released today that at least 35 people died in the aftermath of the August 8th polls. This is out of the 37 people who have been documented to have died as a result of excessive force used by the police. The report, dubbed Mirage at Dusk, gives a human rights account of the August 8th polls. According to the KNCHR report, the other two deaths were caused by civilians. Let's listen in.
One of the most prevalent human rights violations that as a commission we documented were cases of electoral violence. And out of the 1,112 political campaign-related events that as a commission we monitored, 86 of them, which culminates to a percentage of 7.7%, were cases of electoral violence. And that is just a graph of the frequency of violent cases recorded per county in the places where the commission had presence. The most prevalent being Bungoma, followed by Kakamega, Kisumu, Migori, and Nairobi City, with the least being Kisii and Garissa. And also just to mention that in the course of our monitoring of the campaigns, we also documented very worrying cases of places that were not perceived to be hotspots, but were recording very high cases of violence. A good example is Machakos, Makueni, counties that you'd not have expected such high rises of electoral violence. Next.
Right, that's just a snippet of the report that has been released today by the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, and they also made recommendations which are going to look at in a moment. So once again, if I could just mention, the KNCHR says that 35 out of the 37 deaths have been made there by the police are as a result of police using excessive force, and the other two deaths that were also documented were as a result of civilians. And they also say that they have a total of about 102. They had a total of 259 monitors across the country. Out of those, 139 of them are currently still at the counties, just still relaying information on the campaign activities down at the county levels. And from the research and the report that they have released today, they say that all the data they have is from material like videos, photos, audios, and documents that have been produced by their monitors who are spread out across the country. So let's quickly take a look at some of the recommendations that they made before we speak to their chairperson, Kwagwiria Bogori. For the IEBC, some of the recommendations that were made is that they're being asked to conduct elections with strict compliance to the law and the Supreme Court judgment, and this is something they've echoed over and over again since that Supreme Court ruling. They also talked about inducting their electoral officials, or IEBC inducting the electoral officials on voter identification and simultaneous transmission of results, bearing in mind that transmission of results was the major headache in this particular election of August the 8th. They also have recommendations for political parties, which they say that political parties, that is on our next board, recommendations for political parties that they should ensure that their members conduct themselves as per Chapter 6 of the Constitution, which is on leadership and integrity. And of course, this will also, the mention of how the NCIC has been arresting a number of politicians due to hate speech would come in. The National Police Service, they have recommended that the IG, or the Inspector General of Police, ensures adherence to the spirit and letter of Article 37 and its guiding principles. And they are also asking that investigations that have been done by the IPOA should lead to convictions of offending officers. Remember, the National Police Service has been on the hot seat, or on the hot spot, over using excess force, especially on protesters. Well, and finally, let's take a look at the recommendations they make to the general public. They ask that you prepare yourselves to vote on the 26th of October, which is 16 days from now, and they ask you to refrain from making utterances that border along hate speech speech and, of course, irresponsible utterances generally. These are some of the recommendations that are being made there by the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. But let's now focus on the findings first. To give us that update, joining me in studio now is Kogiria Mbogori, who's joining us live from our City Center studios. She is the chairperson of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your presence here on KTN News Desk. Let's quickly go through some of the findings, the grave findings that the KNCHR came up with in this particular report.
Thank you very much, Akisa. Some of the findings that we did, because we were monitoring from the pre-election period, during the election day itself, and in the post-electoral environment. And one of our key findings was that the pre-election period was marred by some violence.
Yes.
And quite a bit of hate speech from different people. And we addressed ourselves to these issues, and we have continually engaged also with the security agents. And we did a preliminary report, if you recall, soon after the elections. And one of the things we did was actually to really congratulate and commend the police, because they restrained themselves a lot during the pre-election period. And there were very few violent interactions with demonstrators and citizens generally. On the polling day itself, our findings were that there were few irregularities, but there are not so many irregularities, but such as we noted and documented, we have put in our report. And also the security agents worked very well on that day, and I think they were able to quell a lot of unrest or restive crowds.
Yeah.
But the citizens also conducted themselves very well on the elections day, and we had very few incidents on that day.
Yeah.
We had a lot of hope that, therefore, this was going to be a very good election or a different kind of story. And that is why we have labeled our report Mirage at Dusk. Because the mirage is a moving target, and sometimes it looks as if you're going to get the best election, and then in the post-electoral period, what we notice is that when the leaders of the opposition came out and decried irregularities in the concluded elections and called upon the IEBC to declare the leader of the opposition as the winner of the election, we started having a lot of tension rising in some parts of the country, and especially in Nairobi City and Kisumu counties.
Okay.
And soon after the declaration of the results of the presidential election, which were done at 10 p.m. at night, soon thereafter, we started receiving reports of gunshots and tear gas in various places in the country, especially Nairobi and Kisumu. And our monitors have been on the ground for almost two months before the elections, and they are still on the ground right now, and have been monitoring and sending us detailed reports of what is happening on the ground. And in the 3 days of serious unrest that followed that announcement, there was a lot of violence by the security agents against civilians, civilians against civilians, and some of them were just angry and violent demonstrators. Others were just innocent citizens coming from their places of work and caught up in that engagement and in that violence, and unfortunately lost their lives. So, others were just citizens in their homes who were just caught in the crossfire.
So what we are saying is the situation throughout the electoral period was relatively calm until when results were announced. That's when things went haywire.
Yes. Yes, a lot of the unrest that we have noted in both in Nairobi, we monitored Kibra, Lakisama, mostly really the urban poor settlements in Nairobi and particular places in Kisumu, especially the places that are having the violent demonstrations today in Kisumu, were still the concerts of demonstrations even the last time. And a number of people did lose their lives in these confrontations.
Okay. Kagwira,
in our reports, yes. Kisa, we have called up.
Yes, just go on, go on.
We have called upon citizens. We have called upon citizens to remind them that their rights come with responsibilities. So when the Article 37 guarantees a right to demonstration, but every citizen then has a responsibility not to be violent, not to loot, not to destroy other people's property, and not also to cause injuries on other citizens, not to injure other citizens, or destroy the property that belonging to other citizens. So these are responsibilities, and they are responsibilities that are held by every citizen. So this is important also to say that even because whenever I see these very violent confrontations with police, it is very saddening, because when there are these confrontations, we have to have casualties and sometimes fatalities.
Yeah.
There are some people during the last confrontations who died as a result of ingestion of the tear gas because they had pre-existing respiratory problems, for instance. We have a couple of deaths that occurred as a result of that. And these were just innocent citizens who are coming from their places of work or emerging to try and see whether they can buy some burgers to go and cook for their families.
Well, in your report, Kagwira, you also talk about misuse of children, voter bribery, violence and incitement. Could you talk to us at length about that? Absolutely, absolutely. I think in a lot of the elections that we have had in this country, bribery has been has featured, and this particular last general election was not an exemption. But one of the statements we have made is that we have seen a bigger move towards door-to-door campaigning. Which means that a lot of the campaigning happened outside the scrutiny of the public, for instance. And so we can't quite gauge how much money really changed hands, and we suspect that when it's quantified, it's likely to be quite substantial. But in the run-up to the elections, including the political primary elections, and we had a lot of cases of voter bribery, sometimes just candidates and aspirants literally handing money, and they were captured on either video or on photographs doing exactly that. Some of them have since denied, but at least we have had evidence of some of those incidents. But I think this happened across the board, across the political divide. There was a lot of inducement of voters using various bribery methods. Some were issuing blankets. There's a candidate who was giving like water tanks, really high value items. Others used common things like water and bread, which were branded. And these are irregularities, but the fact that they are so common and so even expected by the voters is an indictment on our electoral system, and maybe that's why we're also calling our report a mirage at dusk. We are not yet there, but we believe that we can still get there. We can still hold democratic elections which are full of integrity, and then get the leaders we deserve. But the kind of climate we exist in and the relationship between candidates and their voters is such that there's a lot of value changing hands in order for either to be persuaded
to vote for a particular person or to woo them to vote for a particular person. So that bribery was very present. The other thing was that we have said in our report, for instance, that the Cabinet Secretary, Dr. Fred Matiang'i, on 30th January 2017, issued a directive to the county directors, sub-county directors, and school heads, directing them not to use school children or to safeguard school children from the political environment. And yet, in a number of cases, we saw that children were used in the campaigns, and in a couple of instances, we found that there were some candidates who even held campaigns in schools with school children in attendance. And that was in a complete flagrant breach of the CS's directive. Another thing that we found was that there was a number of incidences of state officers and public officers using state resources in the campaigns. We have captured photographic evidence of quite a number of county vehicles and even state vehicles being used in the campaigns. And in some instances, we had state officers mobilizing votes for their respective, for their party, political parties, in the normal course of their duties. And I think there's a conflict there. And we take issue with Section 23, subsection 1 of the Leadership and Integrity Act as a result of that, because we think it opens an avenue for abuse.
But you, as you talk about misuse of children and it being completely against the law and bribery, could you just talk about whether you've seen any action being taken or whether you've tracked how these situations have been handled by the relevant bodies?
Thank you very much. What we have done, you know, every national institution such as ours has its mandate, and our mandate is a constitutional mandate. Our mandate is to observe, to monitor, to document, and to report. And to guide. So we have issued a lot of advisories to relevant departments, relevant organizations, relevant sectors over this whole campaigning and electioneering time in terms of what the human rights standards are and what they should follow. And then also we have worked closely with other commissions like the NCIC. You know, I'm also a commission of the NCIC, so our commission works very closely with the NCIC in terms of instances of hate speech that we have monitored and reported, and they are taking up and following up on that particular issue. In terms of electoral offences, we've documented that, and we'll pass that on to the relevant parties for further investigation and possible prosecution. Then also in cases where the breaches are by security officers and especially the National Police Service, we have handed over, we will continue handing over all the evidence that we have collected to IPOA, the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, for further investigation and verification, and then also for further forwarding to the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions for possible prosecution. We don't have a criminal investigation mandate, and we also don't have a prosecution mandate. So we have to work with other sister bodies in order to have this done. So, and we have issued this report in line with our own mandate.
Okay. Given these findings and some of the recommendations that you have made, how would you describe the state with which the country finds itself in at this particular point in time? With just 16 days to go, the electoral impasse, the demonstrations that are now to 3 days, and of course the amendments being spearheaded by Jubilee in the National Assembly.
Thank you very much. We were invited by the Select Committee of the Joint Select Committee of Parliament to give our views, and we give our inputs in terms of the proposals for amendments to the electoral law. It is possible some of those amendments could provide some clarity in terms of the electoral goings on. But our recommendations to Parliament was that this is not the best time for electoral reform, because the political tensions are very high, and some of these things ought to be negotiated when the environment is conducive to dialogue. Even so, we noted that the Joint Committee of Senate and National Assembly was properly constituted as per law, and therefore we appeared before them and we gave them our recommendations, our inputs and our recommendations. One of the things which we stand for is that we have a mandate to uphold the Constitution of Kenya and the rule of law. And as a result of that, we have in our report come out strongly in defense of the judiciary and the independence of the judiciary, and we have condemned attacks on the judiciary, because if we persist with condemning our judiciary, we are just really creating a conducive environment for anarchy. So we must really, every citizen has a duty to defend our judiciary, to avoid anarchy, and so that we can be a country that is that abides by the rule of law. Now, the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, annulled the presidential election, and now we are having another election on 26th of October. The position of our commission is that we should all turn out in great numbers, as we did before, and cast our vote, our presidential vote on 26th of October, because that was the ruling of the Supreme Court. Because we cannot all now come out with our scenarios or what should happen now. We have to really follow something, and I think following the rule of law and the dictates of the Supreme Court is the best way to go. And depending on who every person wants to, of the two candidates, opposition candidate or the incumbent president, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, we have a chance to now just go cast our votes once more. And unless we do that, then we will be in abeyance, and it will be a never-ending dialogue. But we have an opportunity now to just follow what was ruled in the Supreme Court, and let's go and vote, and then we also create an environment for any reforms that may be needed going forward.
All right. Way to end it. Kagwere Mbogori, the chairperson of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. Today they released their report on the August 8th polls, pre-election, on election day, and post-election. They dubbed that particular report Mirage at Dusk. She's joining us from the City Center studios. Kagwere, once again, thank you very much for joining us here on KTN News Desk. And as we talk about matters elections, in 16 days, Kenyans go back to the polls to cast their presidential vote. And of course, a lot is happening. NASA demonstrations 3 days a week now. Jubilee continues to spearhead the amendments. And we also understand that NASA leader Raila Odinga is expected to fly out of the country. So a cocktail of a lot of things happening in the country with just 16